Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. We engage in critical and courageous conversations about issues that is connected to equity, fairness, and social justice. We engage in conversations about issues that are local and global. Um, the goal of this conversation is to contribute in building critical consciousness for students or anybody actually who cares about social justice, who cares about understanding structural violence, inequality, and to build a critical consciousness that will bring about a transformative change for building the world a more equitable, fair place. I mean, I find one of the very prominent African American civil rights activist and a very remarkable Black woman, Fannie Lou Hamer, in Harvard, is very useful here. Is that nobody is free until everybody is free. So we are all connected in this. And I often say when I teach that teaching anything historically is a violent act. So today I couldn't tell you that I'm having goosebumps. I don't know Sheryl would not understand this or not. That I am so excited to have this conversation with Professor Sheryl Nomelli. Um, we will have this. I'll just give a brief overview about basically what we'll talk about in Bangla, so that our Bangla audience have a bit of Bengali speaking audience have a bit of understanding. আজকে আমরা যে বিষয়টা নিয়ে কথা বলবো সেটা হচ্ছে আমেরিকান হিস্ট্রিতে দ্য কন্ট্রিবিউশন অফ উইমেন, অর্থাৎ আমেরিকান হিস্ট্রিতে নারীদের কন্ট্রিবিউশন। আমরা প্রায়ই যখন আমেরিকার হিস্ট্রিটা দেখি, আম, এই এত পাওয়ারফুল একটি দেশ, এই দেশ কিভাবে পুরো পৃথিবীতে যেভাবে আম, আম, সেটা হোক পজিটিভ কন্ট্রিবিউশন কিংবা নেগেটিভ কন্ট্রিবিউশন, সেটা হোক কোনো ইম্পেরিয়ালিস্ট সাম্রাজ্যবাদী কোনো আগ্রাসন কিংবা মানে রাজনৈতিক যেই মানে বলয় তারা তৈরি করেছে, আমরা প্রায়ই আমেরিকান হিস্ট্রিতে নারীদের কন্ট্রিবিউশনটা জানি না। তো আজকে আমি শেরিল নোমেলের সাথে কথা বলবো নারীদের কন্ট্রিবিউশন নিয়ে। সো today we will talk about the contribution of women in American history. Sheryl, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. We always talk about, we cannot be, our subjectivity influences our learning immensely. So could you tell us about, a bit about yourself, that your upbringing, where you grew up, what shaped your political perception, and how did you become interested in history?
Oh boy. I was born in the 60s, and the 1960s, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world, the 60s and 70s were full of activism, rebellion. And my parents had met in college, dropped out, and instead of being more activists, they were of the mind, live off the grid, kind of hide from the government so that we're not controlled. And that kept me out of a formal education opportunity, and sort of in an environment that was quite sheltered from a lot of the reality of the times. But we were living on this abandoned military base from the Korean War, about 45 minutes outside of San Francisco. And when that property got sold, there had been some who were sort of part of this cooperative. Some people liken it to a commune. I sort of think of it more as a cooperative, lots of farming and just sort of self-sufficiency. But my parents were very much influenced by this opportunity to get involved in this religious organization, and that caused my dad to go back to school. We couldn't live off the grid anymore. And so I was about 10 before I was introduced to any sort of formal education. They didn't want me indoctrinated by the man, is how they would put it. But because of that, I was really behind educationally, academically, and I didn't do well in terms of socializing and following rules and regulations in a formal education environment. And my parents were kind of hands off when it came to parenting. I'd with lots of freedom, maybe too much. And so I often just didn't go to school, even when I was supposed to. So I had very few years of formal education. And when I was about 15 years old, I was struggling to get a decent job because of this. And we didn't have a lot of money growing up. Even if I wanted something as simple as shampoo, I needed to buy it myself. So I realized I needed to go to school, get some sort of education, even if it was just like a high school diploma, so that I could get make some money and take care of myself. I took this test called the California High School Proficiency Exam. I was too young for the GED to get an equivalency of a high school education. So I took that at 15, studied really, really hard from a book I got at the library, and then I was able to go to college. But you can imagine that that was a bit of a struggle with so little formal education. But I was precocious. I worked really, really hard. It was an hour and 45 minutes on the bus each way to get to this college campus. And I did it every day. And for 2 years, I had a terrible history class. My instructor was the worst. It was a first half of U.S. history. Every single class, all he talked about was raping and pillaging, which obviously colonization does involve this, but that's not the only thing that happened. I hated the class. I never wanted to take a history class again. But long story short, I got distracted, marrying young, having a family young, continuing with these low-paying jobs. And at the age of 30, I convinced my husband that even if I needed to take out a student loan to go back to school, it would be an investment in our family's future. And he agreed. And that was when I was first introduced to a women's history course that I couldn't get enough of. I couldn't wait to go back. That was my favorite class I was taking. And I was fascinated by it, also angry. Every class I left going, what? Women were treated like this? That's terrible. And I mean, I had no idea that women had no voice in this country until 1920. I had no idea that they couldn't go to the same schools that boys went to, just because I, again, didn't have a lot of education, but it's not really taught women's roles and experiences and contributions in most history classes in this country. So that's when I was hooked and changed my major to history. And yes, I love it.
I think if I'm not mistaken, in one of the books of Friedrich Nietzsche, he talks about that one of the biggest risks or flaws philosophers do, they look at somebody ahistorically. Cheryl, there is a feedback. Can you hear that?
Oh, see, that's what I was worried about.
Now there is no feedback now.
No?
No. So what did you do?
I didn't do anything, but
Okay.
I'm turning my volume down slightly to see if that will help it to keep from coming back. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry. So one of the things that we don't understand enough is that teaching anything ahistorically is a violent, knowledge-based violence. So the question is that why did you feel interested to, I mean, you have given a bit of background. Let's say somebody who is beginning to understand America. Why is it important for anybody to understand women's contribution in the history of the United States?
Well, for most of the history of the United States, it's been written by men, about men, and men have been the movers and shakers, leaders in government, it's a patriarchal society, a patrifocal society. The focal point has been men of white European descent who are, largely in control of the founding of the colonies and the nation. But this meant that only represented a small percentage of society. If poor people, ethnic minorities, and women aren't having their contributions and their roles acknowledged, then the message of discrimination and bigotry against those groups is sent through our histories, that those people don't matter, their contributions weren't significant. And again, this breeds discrimination against those groups, and it erases the importance and value of those groups to the success of this nation from its founding to present.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Do we have a feedback issue again?
No, it just okay. It reduced now. So we understand that when the history is written by man, about man, and it's a patriarchal society and it's a patriarchal society, there is, however, a direct connection to the kind of economic system where we operate. It's very hard for me to understand the marginalization of women or any marginalized groups without seeing some kind of connection to the political economy that is actually influencing their life. Could you, let's say somebody who has not taken any history lesson whatsoever, wants to begin, I know there are many, wants to begin to understand, oh, these are some of the contributions of women in American history. That is massive, but we don't know nothing or very little about it.
Well, even so, if we go all the way back to the founding, the original colonies that are mostly established by British Protestant Christian immigrants. And we discover early on that women in these early colonies, and especially frontier regions where the population is fairly small, have more opportunities than they would if they stayed back in England. They have more opportunities for literacy. They have more opportunities to engage in a local economy. If you were lucky enough, fortunate enough to have a spinning wheel or a weaving machine, you could barter your services and engage in that local economy. It was so valuable and so important to women at the time that at a time in history when almost nobody is, very few men even, writing wills and leaving wills behind, we have evidence of women getting somebody in writing to leave a will behind to make sure that their daughter or family member would get their spinning wheel when they passed, because it created opportunities for them. But then as these colonies begin to grow and develop, you see very quickly women's voices being shut down again. Fewer opportunities to engage and participate outside of the household. The number one way women are written about in government documents or histories is the number of children they're bearing. It's vital to the success of a society that women continue to bear children, grow, which makes producers, helps the success of an economy and a society. If you were attacked by an enemy, you need lots of young people to work and fight. So that is a very important contribution, but it diminished all the other ways that women were engaged in the success of their local communities as well.
One of the, I mean, it's, if I were to ask one question, and I really would want you to answer this question, is that, let's say from Bangladesh or from any part of global south and etc., we have a very predominantly wrong perception about America. Is that, these women marginalization happens in Bangladesh, it happens in India, it happens in this part of the world. But look at countries like, look at developed countries like America, where women empowerment is phenomenal, or it's a thing of the past. I read when I first came to know about it, I was like, oh my God, it wasn't until 1975 that women's jury duty in the United States. I mean, just imagine 1975. Bangladesh became independent in 1971. Women didn't have any voting right, the suffragette movement, in the 1920s, 1930, I think?
1920.
1920, yeah. So, given the question that we think, oh, this is a problem of the global south, this is the problem of the, but no, I mean, in America, look at it, women have arrived. Could you help us understand, is it true? If it isn't, how it is not true?
It is true. And, I think it's fascinating that you asked this question, because I am so fortunate on the campus that I teach in Los Angeles County. Los Angeles Pierce College is where I teach. We have a large immigrant and international student population, which is one of the things I love so much about being on this campus, because it just makes it so much more vital and interesting and exciting and dynamic. But I find that my international and immigrant students who have not been exposed to U.S. history in their younger years, in an elementary school or a high school, they are shocked when they learn that women were legally, once they married, under femme covert or coverture status. Legally, women in this country were viewed as property of their husbands. And if they were fortunate enough to even have any property that they brought to the marriage, suddenly their husband now owned that property. And if their husband, divorce laws grow very quickly once it becomes the United States. Puritans in the New England colonies were a little more of a radical Protestant group. They allowed divorce for abandonment or impotence if you couldn't bear children. And always the woman was blamed for that, whether it was her fault or not. But divorce laws grow very quickly once it becomes the United States. And you would think, oh, well, that means, women who are abused can finally have protection. But no, that's not what happens. Women who had been property of their husbands won't file for divorce, even for abuse, because there's no alimony, no income she'll get, and the husband keeps the children. He keeps custody, even if the divorce is for abuse, because he owns the property, he has the income, he has the means to raise those children. She has nothing. She's lucky to walk away with the dress on her back. And people are shocked by this. They didn't have education access. They didn't have legal rights in their own name to own property once they were married, run a business once they were married. And they have to really fight so hard for every little bit of opportunity and access and right. And as you said, not until 1920 do women finally in this country who are citizens get the right to vote. And it takes even longer to overturn those femme covert or coverture laws. Not until the 1960s is it struck down by our Supreme Court. 1970s, uh, a jury of your peers includes women. So yes, it takes a long, long, hard struggle of women organizing to get some rights, and we're still working on it today.
A friend of mine in a conversation said, now I often say this with absolute humility and very courageous intellectual integrity. Not to. I mean, I believe in my own this mantra that I believe that I will not fear to question any content of my consciousness to understand my position, to understand what's happening, what's going on in my psyche. So a friend of mine was saying that when I first came to America, and a lot of my friends were from rural America. I was sort of surprised to see that me coming from Bangladesh, I held a more progressive worldview compared to my peers from rural America. And then I was obviously, because we're good friends, I was saying that, do you know there's a thing, privilege has a capacity of making us blind? So I was saying that, you see, you don't represent Bangladesh. You are a very small minority of Bangladeshi women who have made it to the United States to be able to afford to pay the kind of tuition fees that America charges for international students. So you have had generational privileges, which is why you have been able to come to America. You have had generational privileges where women's education is valued to the extent that you could come here. So one of the things that we often forget to analyze is that dialectical social relations needed for any capitalist mode of production. We have to create conflict. White versus black, man versus woman, American versus non-American. We always have to create, that struggle. But then comes, wonderful person like Cedric Robinson says, hold on. This conflict happens, but it happens around the racial line. Now, I'm going to ask an uncomfortable, complicated question for you and for me, both of us, to understand. When I see a lot of feminist movement, you will see that it seems like it's a white women's movement. A lot of the time, white women fail to understand the social realities of Black women, Indigenous women, immigrant women, people of color. In the data, not my opinion, in the data, you will see, if I look at the data, that white women are more privileged in terms of economic opportunities, political opportunities, compared to Black men, immigrant men, people of color, if you look at the overall data. Now, women are already marginalized, but then if you look at in the marginalization, but then what happens, we lose a kind of debate that is it a class struggle or gender struggle? We say intersectional, but our own privileges blind us. Could you tell us that where do we actually start, unpacking to understand first, race, second, sexuality. Third is that status. Are you an American citizen? Like that small piece of paper that we call passport decides who deserves to live or whether you have no right to live, right? I mean, so much so that in America, every day in the morning, your hand on the chest, oh, the land of brave and all of that, that we take it so seriously that we will not hesitate to pull the trigger to end a life because we are protecting our Americanness. Could you speak to that? Could you help us, how do we tease it apart?
Well, yes. Yes and yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to me when I am teaching history of the United States and women's roles, or even just a regular history course, to acknowledge to my students that I recognize I'm a product of white privilege. I may have had a very humble background, but I had very few roadblocks to my opportunities. And it's because of my white privilege. I'm a woman. I recognize the sexism that I've experienced, but I also recognize I don't have on top of that racism that I've had to deal with. And that's given me, again, many more opportunities. And it also shapes how we view things through that lens of white privilege. And so it's important to always be looking at issues from other perspectives, so we can create opportunities for empathy and understanding, and then also activism for change. That said, I would say early on in the first wave feminist movement in the United States, we're talking about really the 1840s. You have these white women of privilege who have been fortunate enough to either be raised in a Quaker community that educated girls the same as boys, that was rare, or a wealthy Protestant household that had tutors come in, even if their daughters couldn't go to a public school, for example. Their fathers were wealthy enough that tutors were brought in to provide them educational opportunities. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one of the founders of the first wave feminist movement because she started organizing. She was an abolitionist. She recognized an abolitionist in this time period as somebody who wants to end enslavement, enslaved labor across the country, because we had certain states that still allowed slavery at that time of Black people, descendants from Africa brought over here against their will. So she's exposed to now both sexism and racism, because when she's going to an abolitionist meeting, she can't sit with the general population. In fact, they don't even really want women there, period. So she's experiencing these things, and she later works with Susan B. Anthony, and they form this really fantastic organization that is working towards women's rights and opportunities, but they're not inclusive in terms of Black women. And in fact, one of the most controversial things that both Stanton and Anthony do is after the Civil War ended in the United States in 1865, Congress is working towards giving some rights and opportunities to freed people. Slavery has ended with the 13th Amendment to our Constitution for most forms of slavery, I will say. But this group of 4 million freed people still don't have citizenship rights. They still don't have opportunities under our Constitution. And so a 14th Amendment is proposed by Congress, but it says, as citizens, Black men should have the right to vote. And Stanton and Anthony are outraged by this. Why would you use the word male in an amendment to our Constitution? Because then that's going to make it even harder for women to have these rights to suffrage, to vote. And so both of these women begin to campaign against the 14th Amendment, or at least to change the language. And they're seen as being against rights for freed people. Yet they helped write the 13th Amendment and get it passed, even though they couldn't vote, because they wanted slavery to end. So it's this very strange dichotomy between we want rights for everyone, Black people included, but if you're going to exclude women and you're going to put the word male in the 14th Amendment in terms of voting, we'd rather you not pass that law rather than pass it to help this group at this time. And it creates racial tension between white women of privilege and the Black community, who's newly freed and need a leg up, need help, access to opportunities. And that continues even into the second wave feminist movement we see, unfortunately.
Wonderful. Now, understanding that the tension that existed, and then beautifully you have said that you so when you teach a class where you have students from all different corner of the world coming to your class, um, do you think that, so you mentioned that your students felt surprised by knowing that, oh, this is the attitude towards women? What are some of the most, in your experience, preconceived notion that international students or your friends who were not born and raised in America come and like feel shocked? Like, what are some of the early, very violently observable attitude, other than that women being the property of husband, women treated as a chattel? What are some of the other evidences, experiences, attitude of United States towards America that we need to be mindful of to understand women's current subjectivity?
Well, there's a great example from this early colonial period. There's a midwife named Anne Hutchinson. Midwives during this time period were given the highest pay of any job outside the home a woman could earn, and considered the highest status because it required training, and these people were having babies like rabbits. They were having children all the time. And so we don't have obstetricians, gynecologists, doctors who fulfill this role for women. It's a midwife who you would seek out. And so this woman is very popular. She's also seen as very godly. She knows her Bible very well. We think maybe she had a photographic memory because she could spout a Bible verse at the drop of a hat. And so people just really admire her. But when she starts questioning some of the Puritan theology in terms of predestination, are Puritan Protestants the only ones who will go to heaven? Are we the predestined chosen people? That's what they're teaching. But they're saying, in order to prove this, you must work very, very hard to be successful, to prove that God is blessing you as his chosen people. And so there's this whole like work hard to prove you're saved concept with predestination. And she begins to speak out against that. And she's holding meetings in her home. When the minister finds out what she's telling women, and these women are going home to their husbands and telling them this, she gets in trouble. She gets put on trial for heresy. And even though in this trial, obviously not a jury of her peers, a few male leaders of the colony, she's found guilty of being a husband rather than a wife, a preacher rather than a hearer, a magistrate rather than a subject. Those are the in the transcripts when they find her guilty, that the local minister says to her, and they kick her out, completely remove her from the colony because she's seen as dangerous. They can't control her. She believes that she has a one-on-one relationship with God, and she's going to stick with that. No man in her community is going to tell her what to do. Right after this trial that takes place in 1637, what we see happening, especially in the New England colonies, but across the board, is that a number of women are also being put on trial now for minor complaints, often things like slander, where you're saying something terrible about your neighbor that ruins their reputation. If women would not say, yes, I am guilty of this slanderous comment, they were tortured into confessions. They were strapped into dunking chairs and submerged underwater, sometimes several times until they would confess. We know that when people are tortured into confession, most of those confessions are false. You'll say whatever you can to stop the pain or the fear of death. But it's a concerted effort to shut women's voices down, limit their opportunities in the public sphere and influences. Even within the churches, these Protestant Puritan churches, women are no longer allowed to speak. They're no longer allowed to hold these roles that they normally would before. They're removed to the far back corner in terms of seating even. So they're not to be seen, they're not to be heard. And this is happening for another, 10, 20 years to shut their voices down. Fast forward to the end of the 1600s, you have these outrageous witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, where over 200 people are accused of being witches. 80% of those people are women. And by the way, it's mostly teenage girls doing the accusations, but they know that they can get away with targeting the most vulnerable in their society, often widowed, middle-aged women. And the kind of evidence used to convict people back then didn't have to be proven. So it's pretty disastrous. And it really does paint women as dangerous, paint women as a segment of society that needs to be limited and controlled. And this continues. And when my students hear about stuff like this, especially those who have never been exposed to this before, again, they're shocked because their view, what they've learned about the United States, from whatever they've been exposed to in another country, is it's this beautiful democratic experience and experiment that has given everybody a voice, everybody an opportunity, which of course, unless you're a white male, you've had to fight very hard for decades and even centuries to get a voice and opportunities.
And so because I'm a teacher and I work with some of the very marginalized communities in Bangladesh, and I very gently try to disillusion young girls and women students, saying that if you want to go to States or global North for studying, that's wonderful, and I'm all for it. But please don't go there with an idea, a fantasy of America. One of the dangers, and I know that I'll be burned at stake for saying this, one of the things that I am unapologetic about expressing the naked reality, structural inequality, whether it is America or whether it is Canada. At least up until this point, I still have relative freedom and security of expressing the truth without fearing direct political retribution. But it has happened after I completed my immigration. And I often say this, is that, let's say, if you have the freedom to speak, if you have consider this as a privilege. I don't think a lot of, undocumented people in the United States can express their mind. It's a system, it's a structural violence that is inflicted upon them. And Canada is no different. And here, in terms of women's marginalization in America, Sabrina has given a wonderful example. That another example is that comes into my mind, that many women writers used to write with the name of males.
Yes.
Thank you, Sabrina. That is a wonderful example. I don't know. I couldn't agree. I mean, this is a wonderful example. Dilara has asked you a question, that how do you see the tokenism of diversity where women, race is pretty much similar, Do you think that at least because of tokenism, there is entry point somewhere? I think with this, Dr. Snigdha's question, a very notable anthropologist from Bangladesh, is that being a white woman does not mean white women does not have any oppression. Don't you think in academia this matter is rather ignorant, and because of the binary construction, white women and black women? So we are trying to understand the binary of black women and white women. And Dilara's question of women as a way of particularly diversity issues, and I see it in Canada all the time, is that whenever you talk about diversity, equity, and sort of thing, gender is always the first card because that's easy to deal with. But we have hired, women, but you look at them, particularly in academia. Oh my God! And so, how do you approach these two issues?
Well, it's very much an issue, and in academia in particular, the demographic, the ethnic demographic of the campus that I teach on is close to 45% students of Latinx or Mexican American descent, and only around maybe just less than 30% of white students, and then a number of other ethnic minority groups that make up the rest: Asian, Pacific Islander, Black, a variety of other Middle Eastern groups of students. Yet, in my own department, it wasn't until 4 years ago that we hired a Black historian who could then create an environment to teach an African American history that legitimized it. I mean, I can teach African American history. I'm very well versed in that history, but students identify with instructors who they can relate to, and it legitimizes. A man could teach women's history, but would he be seen as legitimate in terms of his point of views and what he chooses to speak about as maybe a woman? So we've been really working hard to look at the ethnic demographic of our student population, and making our faculty and staff and administrative population be more reflective of that, to show that we recognize that this is an area that we need to improve in. And it's hard because the people that you end up having on hiring committees choosing also have their own preconceptions, and oftentimes more people in power still do tend to be white and male. But racism and sexism go hand in hand.
And capitalism, perhaps.
And capitalism, yes.
Yeah. I remember a great piece by Fareed Zakaria in terms of not simplifying or understanding the immigrants' reality. I give this reference to this book all the time. There's a book called Bengali Harlem. So that book documents that how Muslim men from Bengal, from Bangladesh, and the West Bengal now, that used to be together before the British Engineers Division and Control Policy. Bengali men came to New York as early as 1890s. At that time, a lot of Bengali men, these were indentured laborers, like, it's a different kind of slavery, you could say. some Bengali men jumped ship, and these Bengali men were supported, protected by Black women, by indigenous women, by Puerto Rican women. They married these Bengali men. And what happened, especially the Asian Exclusion Act, that, the Asians, this made it very relevant and try to understand that how America portrayed immigrants at different point in time, just as in post 9/11, what does it mean to be a Muslim? It's totally changed. Like prior to 9/11, you had one enemy, Russia, they're coming, Red Scare, and now the Muslim scare, so Farid Zakaria, being Indian Muslim, in one of the interviews, was talking about it, is that not to put all the immigrants in one broad stroke. Like, for example, some of us have come here, and we have come here with immense privileges. I will give you one example from Canada, where I am located. In Canada, let's say one of the universities, University of Toronto, if you want to study here as an international student, you have to pay annually 61,000 Canadian dollars tuition fees. If you can afford that kind of money, in many cases you are more privileged than many Canadians who are born and raised here. And international students are actually cash cows for the universities. Like, this is how you generate a lot of revenues. But what's happening at a department like history, we are talking about how can we hire people from other backgrounds, but then look at the neoliberalization of academia, the assault on the humanities, the assault on departments like history, philosophy. We don't need those departments, because if you go to those departments, you'll start becoming thinking, and critical thinkers are a threat to authority. It doesn't matter whenever. So, neoliberalize, so when you were saying that in the witch trial, that it was like so poignant that we are heading towards in a way that shrink the department. So obviously the number of hiring people will be, like how many people that you're hiring. I often feel conflicted about it, is that we don't understand that I may come from Bangladesh with enormous privilege. If you think about India, the caste privilege, oh my God, we don't want to talk about it, because I may come to America with the brown skin, but in many ways, it would be very difficult for you to imagine the kind of privileges that I come from. After Second World War, when America catapulted to the superpower position, this is what boggles my mind. The women, if I want to think rationally or logically, that yes, now the superpower America, the women, have been liberated. But even today, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to individual state policy, it baffles my mind. What happened in post-Second World War that held women back, that was structurally marginalizing women?
It's there's a cyclic history in the United States, and we can see it going back even to the Revolutionary War. Women worked as daughters of liberty to support the boycotts that male leaders had against British goods, to help make weapons and serve the war effort in every way they could from their local communities. But as soon as the Revolutionary War ended, while it was recognized that women had all of these contributions, it was also women were pushing harder for access to education, and it was seen as, oh, this might be dangerous. A woman with too much education, men who were afraid of this said would be dangerous. They would lose their femininity. They would be antisocial. They wouldn't choose to marry and have children because they would have a choice. And that was scary. We need these women in these traditional roles. We have this new founding country. Whenever there's a time of chaos, women are looked to as a stabilizing force. We see this happen again. Women during World War I, mobilizing to support the war effort, but also pushed hard and said, if you're going to fight abroad for democracy and the voice of people in places like Germany, then why are you keeping people at home from having those same rights? And that's how they got the 19th Amendment. They gave women the right to vote by pushing so hard on this issue. Fast forward to World War II, our government creates this huge propaganda campaign called Rosie the Riveter. Beautiful images of women holding tools in overalls, working for the war industry. We have a huge 10 million man army. We're fighting in World War II in the Pacific theater, in the European theater. And we need women at home to help us outproduce our enemies. 18 million women heard that call, and they took jobs in the war industry. They even tested planes coming, dangerous jobs, testing airplanes to see if they're viable for flight, and then training military men to use those same planes. Many times these women had more skills than the men they were training. That's why they were the trainers. So they're in these really important roles. We even opened up limited roles in several branches of our military to women during the last 2 years. 18 million women working in factories, a couple more million women in the military. The second the war ends, the government changes their campaign. Now it's time for women to go home, get married, make babies. We've lost a lot of men. We need to repopulate. Now is not the time to be fighting for equal status. We're still in chaos. That Cold War erupts very quickly between the United States and the East. And a lot of fear. And so these propaganda campaigns run by our government showed film footage of children playing in the streets and smoking cigarettes, and said, all this time that women have been working outside the home has created a generation of juvenile delinquents. And it's dangerous. We need you at home taking care of those kids. Suddenly, newspapers and magazines were advertising recipes that would take 8 hours to make. Go home, be a good housemaker, be a good wife and mother. Don't threaten our society by trying to stay in the workplace. We need to give those jobs back to men. And to be fair, it was World War II that got the United States out of a depression, created more jobs than we could even fill. And the fear was we would go back into an economic depression as well. So create, a place for men back in industry. Women go home. Be a stabilizing force. We need you from the home front. But this meant that so many women who still had no choice but to work went back to menial jobs, very, very low wages with no voice or rights, restaurant work, domestic work, isolating, depressing for women who had done really big, important things during the war. And now they're shut down again.
I remember a friend of mine made a very insightful comment once, saying that there are very few things that worries, concerns, intimidates men than educated, happy, single women. You're single, you don't have children, and you're educated, you're independent, and you're not in need of men. You're not in need of, so that scares men. But I want to go even further, try to understand that the political economy of women's contribution, their autonomy, their agency, their body, their reproductive rights, this is not just, they're not apolitical, but we often try to moralize, we often try to simplify it, and in the process we do more harm than help. One critical question before I want to understand the contributions of Black women, Indigenous women, particularly also Asian women, given the fact that right now, after the COVID, the pandemic broke out, in America, more than 2,000% increase in anti-Asian racism. Um,
Yes.
both when we're talking about war and the economy that depends on war, look at the striking similarity between Vietnam and Afghanistan. It baffles my mind. It feels like our historical amnesia. I I I
Yes.
I don't know how to put it.
It's so frustrating. Keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again.
Yeah. And if I were, I mean, I did some research on British education policy right after the Second World War, during also the Second World War, that what Churchill was preoccupied with immensely. He prioritized two things exceptionally higher than most things. One is history, the other one is language. What history to be taught to students in Britain, and what kind of history, and this is what is important, what kind of history Britain will export to shape the narrative of the world. Also, the language. Churchill, while he was receiving his honorary doctorate degree from Harvard, he very openly said that the new frontier of land to control is not land; it's the minds of men, and hence think about the language. Because if you can control the language, you can control the mind. And I think, like, I mean, obviously he's a murderer. He's one of the most spectacular genociding maniac that history has known, but very few will call it what it is. They glorify Churchill in his grandiose linguistic superiority, that here's a man who got Nobel Prize only for his speech. I feel cringy in my skin when I think about the worshipping of language, rhetorics, of men who have committed such atrocity of such scale. I think it was Chomsky. Yeah, Chomsky once made this comment that if every U.S. president were held um, standard to Nuremberg trial, they each would be, criminals. They each would be criminals. That understanding that, oh my God, particularly when Obama got in office. Yes, we live in post-racial society. Racism has gone away from America, and very few actually recognize that more people are deported in the Obama administration than
Yep.
even Trump administration. And Obama's as drone assassination
Oh,
campaign.
yes.
I mean, I don't know, right?
Devastating.
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 And when I read the history that when German authorities sent people to America to say how they actually keep things in place, even Nazis felt that racism in America is too extreme. I was thinking, what?
Studying
Yeah,
Jim Crow laws in
yeah,
the United States helped them create their Nuremberg decree. I love, I don't know if you could see, I have Wilkerson's Cast book back here. Last summer, that was my summer reading.
Hmm.
And she goes into such great detail on that. And it's so important to understand these discriminatory laws that not only did the United States create, that were held in place for a good 100 years after enslavement ends, to keep that same segment of the population from ever realizing their rights of citizenship and full participation, uh, was used by the Nazis. And then the United States is often painted historically as, we beat the Nazis, but we helped create the Nazis. And that's never discussed in history.
yeah,
Not in
yeah,
my
yeah,
country anyway.
yeah. And also the European contribution in creating spectacular misogyny. I mean, I've read history that when the white men first went to South Asia, in India, they for the first time encountered um, uh, um, god like Kali, a woman goddess who is so powerful. This such, their one meaning of Kali, it means time. So, understanding the centrality of women in Hindu mythology, in Eastern, the prominence of women in the existence, these stories of creation, etc., it baffled white men, because these are Christian white men. Because you don't prioritize women, and now they're baffling understanding. Oh my God, how come they're so and creation of that, creating that binary, creating that psychic schizophrenia that you look at the women. Yeah, that's something that reflect on it. It's so much, like, so much garbage in the mind that we grow up with, especially in the post-colonial societies. In order to unlearn it, it's such a massive task.
Yes.
Why do you think that with this kind of flagrant history, both in 2016 and 2019, a man like Trump, his famous Hollywood bus, bantering that he can do whatever he wants to women, both in 2016 and 2019, overwhelmingly white women voted for Trump. This is my last critical question about understanding the subjectivity of white women, understanding what is it holding them back to understand their own oppression and to build solidarity to fight against it.
I wish I could give you just a single one line, here's, boil it down, right? But I will say, so devastating to me personally to see this. It's a failure of the education system in the United States for so many white Americans to not view the language used by Trump, the behavior seen by this man as dangerous, and this idea that if you feel like you've been left behind, if you're in a maybe a more rural community that's struggling economically, this idea that if we just blow up the whole system, bring somebody into office like we've never had before, who's going to drain the swamp and change everything from what it used to be. We'd rather see that than continue with what we have. And I do sort of understand that thinking because it comes from extreme frustration and devastation. They see no way forward, no future for them in this country. And so that was appealing. This idea that so many white women went along and participated, even with that very sexist attitude and language from Trump, is, again, a failure of our education system. It's also a failure of our economic system that a lot of discussion the year after Trump was elected about, the flyover states that don't get attention, they don't get the programs that they need. But it really begins, I would say, with a conservative religious right movement in the United States in the late 70s, early 1980s, that was a backlash to progressive programs that responded to the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the Red Power movement for indigenous people, Mexican Americans joining, all these movements insisting on not just their rights, but their opportunities and their stories and their histories being told. And so our education system explodes with, women's studies programs, African American studies, Mexican American studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, which is fantastic, but it freaks white men out. And within a religious right movement, women like Phyllis Schlafly, a very well educated white woman, is campaigning against the Equal Rights Amendment for women, saying it's dangerous. Women have worked hard for some privilege. They finally get alimony. They finally get, preferred custody in many of their divorce cases of their children. We can't, we don't want women drafted like men. And we've just had this terrible, devastating war in Vietnam. And so it resonates a lot of women who are part of that Protestant Christian right-wing movement willingly take a second seat to their husbands. They're going to vote like their husbands and their daddies, not for their own interests. And that is sadly still real today.
I mean, as a teacher, before coming to Canada, living in Canada permanently, I used to think, oh, maybe in Canada, the state of critical education is fantastic. Maybe in the United States, the schools and colleges, and I tell a lot of the parents, I used to be a high school guidance counselor, and some of the parents who have the financial abilities, they want to send their kids for high school education in the United States or in Canada. And I tell them, why? Why? I mean, you don't understand that you're not sending your child to Canada or United States, only a child. Do you understand the kind of racism, bullying, structural violence your child is going to face without any support system? So, I mean, I used to think back in Bangladesh that maybe the critical education in Canada or America or in these countries are fantastic. But again, because I am now part of the same system, is that our state of critical thinking baffles me. And when you were saying the failure of education system, is that, yeah, and similar kind of things happen in many parts of the world, especially in many of the Asian countries, that grades, you have to get grades. And then this is one of the places where I think this document is very important for teachers, is that in 1975, there was a document, it's called Crisis of Democracy. In that document, 3 locations of the world, Japan, Western Europe, and America, nominate a very prominent figure like in Huntington, the Clash of Civilization guy. He was saying is that, because of right after 60s, right, that, there has been too much freedom in schools, too much thinking in school, and the institutions have failed to by the way, they used the word indoctrinate, they didn't hide it, that the schools have indoctrinated their students, and therefore they are doing all of this. So this is important. Now, in American history, what are some of the remarkable contributions that we fail to see? Women like Black women, Indigenous women, Jewish women, women of color, that you think that if we knew them just the way we know, McDonald's, this guy has done this, or, Steve Jobs, this guy has built the first $1 trillion company in the history of humanity. Could you tell us some of those examples so that we can have a more holistic perspective?
Absolutely. And I was so excited to hear you quote Fannie Lou Hamer. She's one of my favorite women to talk about when I'm talking about the civil rights movement, because, Rosa Parks is like the well-known heroine, not giving up her seat on a bus. But Fannie Lou Hamer comes from this large sharecropping family in Mississippi. She's the youngest of 19 children. She has to drop out of school in the 6th grade and become a sharecropper in the fields. And it's not until she is married to another sharecropper, and it was a common law marriage. They couldn't even afford a marriage license, and trying to have a child of her own. She has fertility issues, very much unlike her mother, and had some stillbirths and miscarriages. And she goes to a free medical clinic where they tell her she has to have a cancerous tumor removed from her abdomen that's interfering with her ability to carry the pregnancy forward. She has this operation and can't get pregnant. Before she could at least get pregnant, if she couldn't carry it to term, discovers almost a year later she has been sterilized, involuntarily sterilized by this doctor at this free clinic. She did not give consent. He knew she was there so she could have a child with the man she loved. And she's so devastated by it, she begins to talk to some of her friends, and she discovers that many others have had a similar experience. She's not alone. It's poor Black women who are being targeted in the South with these sterilizations. And the state of Mississippi has just put forward a sterilization bill to legally be able to charge women hundreds of dollars, put them in prison, and for having 2 or more children out of wedlock. Again, she's married to her husband, but not legally. So she could, be in trouble for even just trying to get
Cheryl,
pregnant. Yes.
for Bangladeshi audience, could you explain what is a sterilization?
Sterilization is a medical procedure to keep women from being able to have children, whether it's a hysterectomy, removing organs, or tubes being tied. That's how they would go about that process. And a lot of women who are in the hospital to give birth, if they were an ethnic minority and poor, would be targeted for this procedure with, again, oftentimes without their knowledge. So this is what motivated Fannie Lou Hamer to try to register and vote, because she wanted to be able to vote against this law in her state that would allow other women to be targeted like she was, but even more so. And she discovers very quickly, even though she can't pass the literacy test, that her employer has found out, and that the land that they lived on as sharecroppers, they're fired. They go to stay with friends. Shots are fired into the home, but she won't stop her activism, and she joins civil rights organizations, and she works locally to do her best to register Black voters to vote. In her county alone, the majority of the community is Black. They make up 1% of voters. They had no voice. These Jim Crow laws that legally discriminated against ethnic minorities, in particular Black people, kept them from the right to vote, kept them from equal rights of citizenship, kept them segregated, is still prevalent in 1960 when she's trying to register and vote. So she's one of my heroes. I love her so much. Thank you for mentioning her. And there are so many in the Black community. I would mention, in terms of Indigenous women, there are a number that I like to talk about, but one of the early Indigenous women who's able to really help her community is Susan LaFlèche Picotte. She is from the Omaha Native tribe, and her father was one of the last chiefs of the Omaha people. There's a law that had been passed in the United States in the 1880s that had allowed the government to come in and take over much of tribal lands, divide them up into plots for individual farming, but you had to sever all contact with your tribe and adhere to a legal system much like U.S. laws. And it very much, it took young children as young as 4 years old away from their families to boarding schools to educate them in this white Protestant or white Catholic education system that was very discriminatory and abusive. Susan LaFlèche Picotte, with all of that working against her, is able to get access to a Quaker medical school in Pennsylvania that allowed women, the very first female medical college. Quakers, again, very progressive when it came to education for women and girls. And she comes home and is able to open up a medical clinic and educate her people, not just on better health practices, but also become kind of an intermediary, because now she can speak and read English. She can tell the families in her tribal community, don't let your white neighbors show up with a gift of a bottle of whiskey and a piece of paper they want you to sign your X on agreeing to. They're trying to steal your land. If you think that they have your best interest at heart, bring that paper to me. I will read it to you. I will tell you if that's a good deal for you or not. And so she does really important work for her tribal community. And again, in health and in terms of their relationship with whites that they live in near proximity to.
Yeah, and also I think in terms of Black women, the HeLa cell that today the stem cell research wouldn't have been possible if it was not from a Black woman's body. And I feel so outraged when I think about it. Is that a woman's cell that has traveled around the world is foundational for the stem cell research work.
Without her knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
again,
Mm-hmm.
experimented on. We could go all the way back to enslaved times to see how Black enslaved women's bodies were fetishized.
Yeah. Sarah Bergman.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you
Yes.
speak about Sarah Bartman too, Sheryl? Is that particularly because this is something very relevant? One of my mentors has recently written a book. It's about fetishizing and commodifying Black male bodies. So the book he has written is called, edited, Appealing Because He's Appalling. The whole idea of a racialized body, the fetishization, and how it actually has devastated many and feeling the right that, oh, I mean, she's a Black woman or a Black man or racialized person, so therefore there can be what's your take on that? Sorry, I digressed.
No. Yes, my understanding from my own reading and research on the topic is that what is motivating much of this by white men who are scientists, doctors, is to look at and scrutinize the other, point out what you see as differences that then help to better understand why those differences might make them less than white people. If there's for example, a physical difference in the lips or body parts, then you can look at that as, well, that makes them better for hard labor, or better to, because of the pigment in their skin, to be under the hot sun. Even the fact that you have so much written about hair texture. I mean, why should that matter, right? It makes no difference in terms of your intellect, your ability, and your humanity. But all of those scrutinized, written about, put on display differences in body parts are used to overgeneralize and, again, lessen someone's humanity rather than make them more human.
Exactly. Please continue. And you are mentioning some of the other examples.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm not sure where I was.
Yeah, sorry.
I lost my...
the contributions of. I'm sorry. I really digressed. That what are some of the contributions of, and particularly after post 9, I was very heartbroken when Mira Merzkani, the Iranian woman who got the Nobel Prize of Mathematics, the Field Medal. The Iranian woman, her parents could not come to America after she died because of Trump's Muslim ban, right? So, could you speak about in the atmosphere of Islamophobia, the contributions of Muslim women in building America, and that often gets overlooked, we don't get to understand?
Well, much of the history that I focus on and teach goes up to around 2000. So I don't spend as much time in my coursework, but I do try to always bring in current. Historians have this this thing about, we need a good 30 years to really tell a history, because that's when finally we're getting access to, maybe government documents that have been kept from scrutiny. But yes, I would say much of the activism of many groups of women is a result of persecution, extreme targeting. And what I've been so impressed with, particularly Muslim American women, is their response to the discrimination of activism, coming out and organizing, speaking out, running for office. We have Ilhan Omar, Rashida, I'm not sure if I'm going to say her last name correctly. Please forgive me. Tlaib. I'm not sure if I said it correctly, but for the first time, getting elected to our House of Representatives right after the 2016 election, which was so shocking to so many progressive Americans and women like myself. We saw female activism pushing back against the Muslim ban, pushing back against the marginalization and dismissal of sexism as even being an issue in this country. And you see, in terms of gender representation in Congress, in the very next election 2 years later, kind of explode. And the fact that we could get Muslim American women in the House of Representatives was so gratifying to me, to give us examples that could change the narrative. These are intelligent, rational individuals who care about this nation's future and are invested in this nation's future. I would also just say that on my campus last year, was it last year? 2 years ago, excuse me. Even though Malala
Yousafzai,
Yousafzai, thank you. In terms of my pronunciation, I apologize. We did a book, campus-wide book series of her book, I Am Malala, and showed her film on campus. This was before COVID, when we were actually, everybody was on campus. Her documentary film, He Named Me Malala. And just the fact that she was able to share so much of her personal story about the violence that she had encountered because she just wanted an education. And that her father was so supportive and championing her. It helped to, again, even though she's not a citizen of the United States, it had such an influence in our country, because there are stereotypes since 9/11 that portray Arab, Muslim people as all just being backwards, which of course is not the case at all. And to see this example of, a progressive family who get targeted just because of how they are trying to educate in Pakistan, and what happens as a result, that has been huge for the United States in helping us better understand those communities and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I often say to students who are studying computer science, I say to them that, did you know that it was a woman who wrote the computer program 100 years before the computer came to being? Ada Lovelace was the first computer programmer, not a man, but the field is overwhelmingly dominated by men now. I mentioned to them that, do you know that it was a Muslim woman who founded the first university in Morocco? Fatima Al-Fihri, the first university. So when
I did not know that. That's amazing. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And if you Uh, if you particularly if you look at the feminist uh, towering figures in Egypt, in Morocco. I forgot her name right now. A very, very prominent Egyptian feminist. She said that, feminism is not an invention of the West. It isn't. It isn't. So a lot of the times, let's say you will see that the backlash, feminists, the backlash in many countries, they will say, "Oh, these are the ideas that are imported from the West." Um, there's a famous portrayal that a woman. I'm not saying that throwing hijab is essentially the ultimate epitome of feminism, but if a woman chooses to, who am I to say? And if a woman chooses to wear a hijab, who am I to say you can't? So that's very fascinating. That when I get into conversations like this, and I often also say this. Look, I studied social sciences, so I have had the privilege of coming in contact with incredibly intelligent, strong women role models very early on in my life. But when I was a teenager, like 15, 14 years old, I too had a lot of the perceptions that men are superior. I mean, and this is the things that how institutions, how the culture teaches us about a lot of things. And this is why these conversations are incredibly important to understand that how there's a wonderful documentary about the violence against women in India. It's called The Anatomy of Violence, that deconstructs how very early on that kind of attitude towards women are actually baked into the psyche of young men, and we fail to see. It's a blindness of conviction. It's a blindness of bigotry. It's a blindness of nationalism, and all of that. I'm concerned about the anti-Asian racism after Trump's crazy uh, portrayal of COVID as the Chinese virus, and what have you. How do you see? Could you tell us about some of the contributions of Asian women in building American history?
Well, we had a similar um, government policy against Asian Americans, in particular Japanese Americans, after Pearl Harbor, that is attacked by Japan's military and brings the United States into World War II. It was so extreme that we were, especially on the West Coast where I'm from, literally rounding up uh, Asian and Asian American families to put them in internment, or I would call them prison camps, uh, with only what they could carry. And because we had such strong anti-immigrant laws against Asian Americans coming from all parts of Asia, uh, many of the first generation immigrants did not have citizenship because they weren't allowed. But when their children were born in this country, they became citizens because our 14th Amendment says that. And so you have uh, hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned and targeted. And at the same time that is happening, these Asian American women are becoming Rosie the Riveters, helping us outproduce our enemies, going to work for the war effort. Some of these women are becoming pilots to help test these airplanes. We called them WASPs, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. They don't get paid what male pilots get paid. They don't get any of the benefits of military service, but they're doing incredibly important work. Um, uh, Statisticians, Asian American women working as statisticians, helping to teach in terms of military strategy, how to target certain bombing zones and things like that. At this, it's almost like they are working extra hard to prove their loyalty to this country, who has treated their families so terribly and suspended all their rights here in this country. Yet here they are, their male counterparts, either being drafted or signing up to serve in a military for a country that, again, has taken everything from them and their families. So again, it's this spirit of activism, the spirit of hope. And I do think in the United States, there is a general belief that if you can get that information out there and make people more aware, you can promote change. And that's what gives me hope and keeps me teaching and educating, because I want to promote change. I tell my students, history is a democratizing experience. If you don't know where we've been, you can't understand where we are today, what kind of created this environment, political, economic, racial issues and environment. But once you do understand what created that today, then you're in a better position to engage and help shape the future the way you want it to be. And that, again, because there are days I just want to tear my hair out and say, we keep making the same mistakes. What's going on here? I mean, especially several recent years ago, having the kind of leadership. I happened to be on a vacation in Europe with my husband in 2016. And as soon as people would hear you speak, they would know you were American. And they'd be like, what is going on in your country? Don't you understand? We need you to be stable. And I would just be like, I know. I'm so sorry. I'm doing what I can.
Yeah.
I want to say one more thing, if you don't mind. I know we might be running out of time.
No. Please go on.
I think it's very important to define the term feminism for people to really have a good understanding of what it means, because I think there are so many stereotypes assigned to that term that especially this younger generation of people want to distance themselves from it rather than embrace it. And I believe that to be a feminist is to be somebody who actively supports women having the same rights and opportunities that men have across the board, creating opportunities for equity in all areas of society. That is not saying that women are asking for more rights than men, more power than men, but equal opportunity. And I share this with my students. When I started to teach women's history, I asked my husband, who often would call himself a feminist, around his male friends. And I would hear things that they would say to him, very derogatory comments. Oh, you're so whipped. She controls you. And, he wouldn't be intimidated by that. He would just laugh it off and say, oh, no, I'm a feminist. And he recognized, all the time and would point out, oh, that's so gender bias. And so he's very aware, very supportive. And so I said to him before I started teaching my women's history class, I need to better understand a male perspective here. Why do you choose to claim to be a feminist when you do get some pretty negative comments and backlash against yourself as a man for this? And his answer shocked me. And I'd been married to him for a number of years. I thought I knew everything I could know about him. But he said, I want to live in a world where you, my partner, can earn as much money as any man in your field, because your paycheck goes into the same bank account my paycheck goes into, and I benefit from that. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's kind of a selfish reason for you to be a feminist. You're doing it for you, not for me, because you want to benefit from my income.
Mhm.
He said, I have a widowed mother. I have 4 sisters, uh, 2 of whom are divorced, another that's single. He said, if I live in a world where men have total control, he said, that means I also have total responsibility. If they can't take care of themselves, I have to take care of them. And I also have 2 daughters and a wife. That would be like a noose around my neck. I would have no joy in my life, no opportunities in my life. I'd just be working to take care of all these women in my family. But if I live in a world where women can have the same opportunities in education, the same opportunities in a job, so that they can be independent and take care of themselves, then that means I don't have to take care of them. And so he saw it as not just liberating women, but liberating men, liberating him from that kind of burden. And I found that fascinating. He's a feminist, not because it just helps me and his daughters, but because it helps him. And the same thing goes for racism. Racism, to keep ethnic minorities down, is a burden on white people. We need to, we're complaining about too much taxation and welfare and government programs and, paying healthcare for poor people. Guess what? If we live in a society that lifts everybody up, then your taxes can go for things that you would prefer them to go for, not just people that you've kept from having rights and opportunities.
And as I was hearing you, I felt like I have never met this person. You're not likely to, Miss Begum Rokeya. So it's a very feminist writer, a very notable feminist writer in Bangladesh. I felt like you have been her student.
I wish I would be so fortunate.
Yeah, and I was listening to it, I was like, oh my God. I mean, Sheryl is talking as if she was in one of her classes. She was, but she lived 100 years before this time. Anyway,
I wish I knew her.
yeah, and when I read her now, a lot of the times I happily break into tears, understanding that how my masculine idea of me, I have denied my own humanity to myself. A lot of the times, thinking about it, and this is when you talk about, and I know that I mean, from the podcast that your husband used to work in Navy, he was in
Yes.
American Navy, yeah. I was like, oh, a military man, and having that realization is not. It doesn't come every day. Yeah.
I think that's why I fell in love with him.
Like, oh my God, a military man having that kind of understanding. That's amazing. Anyway, so the other thing about feminism, I often say that it's also like in how we have fear about secularism. Secularism is not hating religion. Feminism is not hating men, that this
Right.
is, men. And I think the fourth way of feminism is, I mean, I participated in a study and then I was talking to 2 researchers about it, is that the women have bought it. Women don't need to. I had one experience, a university black student. She taught me something that I'll always remember. She said to me, a course that we were teaching was migration mobility in Canadian context. So she said this to me, that look, Feroz, I have met a lot of my friends who are white, but they don't know they're white. But I have not met a single black woman who does not know she's a black woman. So, and I mean, in one sentence, she shook my consciousness at a level that, I mean, a lot of the times she would not take part in the class, like in particularly critiquing immigration policy and what. The thing is, I was teaching just a course and I'd be out. That's it. But she would have to spend with those friends for the rest of her, like in undergrad degrees, and a lot of the times it's tiring. It's very tiring. Educating. Not all, but willfully ignorant white men and women is tiring. It's very tiring. is that go do yourself a favor. I mean, read. I'm not.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's tiring.
Robin DiAngelo writes about white fragility and
Mm-hmm.
the responsibility that
Mm-hmm.
white people have
Yeah.
to not have their, acquaintances, their ethnic minority friends or acquaintances,
Mm.
educate them.
Yeah.
Read it yourself. Don't make them explain it to you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also like, sort of, having a schizophrenic consciousness, like, Du Bois talked about double consciousness. I mean, a lot of the times I get into heated intellectual debates with a lot of the white professors, saying that you don't know a body of knowledge that is not in your language. It is a rather very arrogant of you, literally your hubris that you're trying to hide in humility, performative humility, that you are delegitimizing a body of knowledge that has been subjugated and hidden, have oppressed, marginalized by colonial history. So, I was writing in my thesis that, the merit of my thesis will depend on my capacity to translate a subjugated consciousness in a colonial language. If I cannot write, when you write, I will be judged based on, oh, is the preposition is right? Is the semantics and the syntax of the sentence is right? You can't even pronounce Bengali names, let alone reading that body of text. How about that? You subject me to a standard that you don't hold yourself standard? But obviously, when you do that, and obviously this is the treachery of academia, North American academia, that it is, enshrined with a lot of floral linguistics rhetorics that, oh, we are open to have very open and free conversation, hiding the politics of knowledge production in sweet tongue. It's sweet tongue. So, some in this is spaces that I tell international students that, look, humans, the psyche, it gets alarmed quickly. Because a lot of the times professors get attached to their scholarship, their idea. And this is why I want to examine the politics of someone's scholarship. You're right, I get it. You're right, you get it. But I want to know what is the politics of your scholarship. So that is something very important. Feminism is not hating men. Feminism talks about structural changes. Feminism has allowed me to be me, human, to have my emotion, sentiment connecting to my own humanity. You know, that all that kind of garbage that I'm a man, I don't feel pain, all that, yeah, BS. Um, Historically, that was one. But in 2021, in your view, living as a woman in the United States, teaching as a historian, what are the some of the things that you see today? Some of them are very visible, like the woman football player. I forgot her name when she, when they won championship, and they were saying that why women footballers will be paid less than the male footballers. What are some of the visible and subtle discriminations against women that we don't see, but would help us to think?
Um, Maria Shriver published a document. I want to say it was, maybe 2014, on the status of women. And she was using a lot of information from the most recent census records from 2012, 2011, 2012. And of course, we've just in the last year done another census, but collecting census information was very difficult during the pandemic. The records are not easily accessible yet, publishable yet, and who knows how meaningful they will be. But what she brings out are some really interesting things, especially in a time when Obama was president, in a time when women really felt like, we just had a viable female candidate for president. Never before in history had a major political party endorsed a woman to run for president with Hillary Clinton. And of course, she's got lots of baggage. I know that, but it was very exciting to see. And here we get this, status of women report from Maria Shriver saying, this again, I want to say it was around 2014 that I got access to it at first. And it said women still make, as a whole, 79 cents to a man's dollar.
Mm-hmm.
If you break that down ethnically, Black women is 68 cents to a man's dollar. Mexican American women, 58 cents to a man's dollar. This is the United States of America. She said the majority of low income, like minimum wage jobs, 70% are held by women. It's not 50-50 like our population, 70% held by women. Those minimum wage jobs at the time, because this was before the Affordable Care Act had been fully implemented, most of those jobs did not have health care. Most of those jobs had no days off. Women also make up the majority of household, head of household income providers and single parents. So they are raising children on their own. Many of them have elderly parents coming in to be cared for. They are making very little money with no benefits and no days off. And they're supposed to be doing it all. And it's impossible. It's just impossible. So she talked about ways that we could address these issues by, for example, passing a law through Congress that says every job must give a minimum of days off, whether it's sick days, whether it's personal paid days off. We need health care for all. We need job sharing programs that recognize so many women have so much on their plate in terms of family responsibilities and being an economic provider for their families. And she goes on. It was really brought up some major issues that we are still experiencing. And by the way, much of what she has asked for has not been passed through Congress. And the fact that we, even with all our steps forward, still only have a little over 26% women in Congress, who is the most powerful governing body, making the most, laws in this country. And women make up 51% of the population in this country. That shows that continued disparity that we need to work to rectify.
I say this to a lot of my American friends that Hillary Clinton could not win an election in 2016, but Bangladesh, being such a backward country, elected its first female head of the state in 90s. So,
right?
So,
exactly.
So how advanced are you? I don't know if you know this famous joke. Once Gandhi was in UK, and he was said, "What do you think of British civilization?" And he said very cleverly and quickly, "That is a great idea." That is a great idea.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I just wonder. I mean, he does not come across, of course, whatever you read, is that such a witty and very the sense of humor that would be. Yeah. I would like to take a comment from Fariha Jamala. Very, I love her comments and insights. She's a Bangladeshi American. In the United States, younger women below 50, democratic leading women in degree associates feminism with positive ideas as empowering, inclusive. But countries like Bangladesh, with low education rate and religious uptightness, feminism, the term is viewed based on Western history, carries a Western Christian ideal, which conflicts Islamic ideals about women. Please share your view, a secret law that can help remove such roadblocks so this movement contributes advancement of women.
I personally see how certainly religion and culture impacts the ideas of feminism, what feminism might mean to a particular community or culture based on outside influences. And I would say, even in my country, religious views often reject ideas of feminism. This Protestant belief that men are the head of household, men are the ministers of the home, men are in charge, is still very prevalent in our religious beliefs today. And that would be not just Protestant Christian, but many other religious beliefs. If we can try to remove, or maybe not remove, but say feminism can coexist with these different religious ideas, saying that we value. I mean, when you look at even stories in the New Testament, there are some Christians who would say Jesus was the first feminist, because he was, promoting Mary Magdalene, willingly accepting her, even though she was a prostitute, anointing her, forgiving her, whatever, realizing that she was a victim of her circumstance, her time, where she didn't have a family to support her. She had to find a way to survive. And that's what brought her into that industry. And she should not be shunned as a result. So I think, yes, if we just recognize it's really about humanity and common good and rights for all, then I think that's a universal idea. I'm so sorry. I have to go in like 2 minutes. I didn't realize how long we've talked. I could talk to you all day, by the way, and your students.
Yeah. So okay. So Sherry, and thank you very much, Sheryl, to join us today. I think we have so many things that I have asked you questions that need probably a semester to address them. But we will address this in a different time. Quickly to this question is that we have difficulty in understanding the women's subjectivity in Bangladeshi context because of wave of colonialism. Before the European colonization, we also had Arab colonization, but in the name of religion. So our psyche is colonized. And one of the things, all these three faith, Abrahamic faith, like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, it looks at things binarily, that saint and sinner, evil and good, and all of that. But prior to that, if you look at the Vedic philosophy and ways of looking at the world, it wasn't that binary. But that's in a longer discussion. But I couldn't control my temptation to give a brief answer to that. Sheryl, thank you very much, and this conversation to be continued.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
A pleasure, and have a wonderful day. Send my regards to your family, and say your husband that I'm so proud to know that a military man could be such a proud feminist. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
have a wonderful day to you and your students.
Okay, bye-bye.